The letter slid beneath Marianne Whitlow's door just after sunrise. She heard the soft scrape across the wooden floorboards before she saw it, a sound so small it might have been overlooked on any ordinary morning. But today, the cottage was quiet, so quiet that even the slightest disturbance carried weight. She froze with her hand still hovering over the kettle. For a moment she simply stared at the folded parchment lying on the floor, the seal unbroken but unmistakable. Dark wax, perfectly pressed. The crest she had spent years trying to forget. House Hallström. Her chest tightened. She set the kettle aside and walked slowly toward the letter. The morning light made the edges glint sharply, as though it held a coldness of its own. She knelt, picked it up, and held it without opening it. The texture of the parchment felt exactly as she remembered, smooth, formal, distant. A reminder of a life she had left behind with trembling steps 4 months ago. A life that had tried to break her. She drew in a quiet, steady breath and cracked the seal. Marianne Whitlow, your presence is requested at Hallström Manor tomorrow at noon to finalize the matters previously discussed. No greeting, no warmth, no acknowledgement of the month since she walked away. Just a summons. Her fingers tightened involuntarily. She read it twice, then a third time, though each reading left the same cold impression. Cedric Hallström wanted her back at the manor, not as a wife. As a formality, Marianne closed her eyes. For a brief second, she felt the stir beneath her ribs, the faint flutter she had been living with, protecting, cherishing. She placed her hand against her abdomen in a gesture more instinctive than deliberate. 4 months. 4 months since she left the manor in silence. 4 months carrying a life Cedric did not know existed. Mrs. Grant entered from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. What is that you're holding? Marianne handed her the note. Mrs. Grant scanned it quickly, her expression tightening. He summons you as though nothing happened. Marianne said nothing. Words did not rise easily when the past pressed this hard. Mrs. Grant continued, you don't have to go. You owe that man nothing. That man, Marianne whispered, was once my husband, and he treated you as though you were a piece of furniture in his grand hall. Goes end. Marianne exhaled softly, absorbing the truth without flinching. Ignoring him won't make this disappear, and I would rather face him once than wonder forever when he might call again. Mrs. Grant moved closer, placing a warm hand on her arm. If you must go, go with strength, not fear. I will, Marianne murmured. Fear left me the night I walked away, but the moment she said it, the memory returned. It had been winter, then sharp, glittering, unforgiving. The night of the Hallström Winter Gala, when guests filled every hallway with polished smiles and murmured courtesies. Marianne had stood among them wearing a gown of pale silver, her hair pinned in the precise fashion required of a marchioness. She had smiled, spoken softly, moved gracefully. She had played the role perfectly, until Cedric opened his mouth. She remembered exactly how he looked. Shoulders straight, jaw set, expression unreadable. He had not raised his voice. He had not acted in anger. He had simply spoken a sentence that cleaved her world in two. A barren marchioness cannot serve this house. The words echoed even now, months later. Around her, guests had drawn quiet breaths, exchanging looks behind their gloved hands. Some had murmured sympathy. Others had turned away, unwilling to witness the moment her dignity was stripped from her without warning. But Marianne had remained still. Ice-filled stillness, breath-held stillness. She had swallowed the humiliation and waited until the guests returned to their conversations before she walked from the ballroom with steady steps. She had packed her belongings before dawn. She had not told Cedric she was leaving. She had not written him a single line. She had simply slipped away into the snow. Now, as she stood in Briar Hill Cottage with the letter in her hand, she felt none of the crushing despair that had once shadowed her, only a quiet resolve. I will go, she said at last. Mrs. Grant's voice softened. You are stronger than when you left. Marianne lifted her chin. I had to be. She folded the letter and set it on the table. Tomorrow she would stand again in the halls that once silenced her. She would walk through the doors of a home that never felt like one. But she would not go as the woman Cedric dismissed. She would go as the woman who chose to leave, the woman who survived his indifference, the woman who now carried a truth far heavier than the letter he had sent her. Marianne tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Tomorrow, she thought, he will see that I am not the same. If Marianne's return to Hallström Manor stirs something in you, a question, a memory, a feeling, share it with me. Your thoughts may change the way her journey unfolds, and if you'd like to walk beside her a little longer, let me know. Marianne slept little that night. Though the cottage remained quiet, her mind refused to rest, circling the approaching meeting as though examining a wound that had never fully closed. She rose before dawn, her movements steady even as thoughts moved unevenly beneath the surface. The morning held a pale stillness, the kind that makes sound feel heavier, and she could sense its weight in every breath. Mrs. Grant prepared a modest breakfast, though Marianne hardly tasted a bite. She wore a dark blue dress, simple, sober, free of embellishment, paired with a cloak that shielded her from the cold. No jewelry, nothing that belonged to the manor. She wanted nothing that tied her to the woman she had been there. When the carriage arrived, its wheels crunching over the frosted ground, Mrs. Grant accompanied her to the door. "If anything feels wrong," the older woman murmured, adjusting Marianne's cloak, "you may turn back." "I won't," Marianne replied softly, "but thank you." "You're not alone," Mrs. Grant said, squeezing her hand. Marianne stepped into the carriage, settled into the seat, and watched the cottage retreat behind her as the driver urged the horses forward. The road curved through bare hedgerows and quiet fields, all familiar yet distant. She breathed slowly, letting each passing landmark settle her thoughts. She had once travelled this road with a hopeful heart. Today, she travelled it with clarity. As Hallstrom Manor came into view, her chest tightened not with fear, but with the memory of a life lived within walls that had never truly welcomed her. The manor rose with imposing elegance, tall windows gleaming beneath the morning light. Nothing about it had changed, and yet everything felt different. The carriage stopped. Marianne stepped down, her boots meeting the stone steps with a soft thud. She looked up at the towering entrance, remembering the girl she had been when she first walked through those doors. That girl had sought belonging. The woman standing here now sought nothing but truth. The great door swung open. Mr. Ardley, the butler, bowed respectfully. "Lady Marianne, His Grace is expecting you." "Expecting, not welcoming." She inclined her head. "Lead the way." They walked through corridors lined with portraits of Hallstrom ancestors. She felt each gaze like an echo of judgment she no longer carried. Her steps were firm, steady, unhindered by the dread that once clung to these halls. At last, they reached the library. "You may enter," Mr. Ardley said. Marianne opened the door. Cedric Hallstrom stood near the long table at the room's center, reviewing documents arranged in immaculate rows. He lifted his head the moment she stepped inside. "Marianne," he said. Her name sounded unfamiliar in his voice, gentler, quieter, without the distance he once wielded like armor. She closed the door behind her, controlled and composed. "Your Grace." Cedric hesitated at the formality, but did not challenge it. He gestured toward the table. "Thank you for coming. There are matters to finalize." She approached with measured steps. The documents lay neatly arranged across the polished surface, terms, provisions, signatures left blank. Cedric kept his hands at his sides, as though unsure whether to touch the papers in her presence. "I prepared these as instructed," he said. "They outline the dissolution." "I am aware of what they are," Marianne replied. He swallowed lightly. "You may review them now if you wish." She studied his face for a moment, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. His calm expression was familiar, yet she sensed an undercurrent she had never seen before. Something stilled, something uncertain. "No," she said. Cedric blinked. "No? I will not be signing anything today." Her tone was even, quiet but resolute. "I came because you summoned me, not because I intend to give you what you want on your terms." Cedric stepped back slightly, as though her refusal carried physical force. "I did not summon you to coerce you." "Oh?" she asked, arching a brow. "One day's notice, formal language, and a room full of legal papers feels very close to coercion." His hands tightened briefly. "That was not my intention." "Intent," she said softly, "has never erased impact." Cedric looked away, jaw tightening, though not in anger, in something closer to realization. Marianne continued, "I will review the terms when I am ready, not before." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Cedric stared at the papers, as if seeing them for the first time, his expression hollowing into something she could not quite decipher. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then quietly, "I understand." Marianne's breath wavered not from fear, but from the gravity of hearing him speak words he had once been incapable of saying. She stepped back from the table. "That is all I came to say." Cedric looked up sharply. "You're leaving?" "There is nothing more for me here today." He didn't move toward her, didn't reach, didn't demand, didn't command. He simply stood there, still as stone, watching her with a muted expression that almost resembled loss. "Marianne," he said as she reached the door. She paused, hand resting on the handle. His voice dropped. "Thank you for coming." She didn't turn. "Good day, Your Grace." Then she walked out, closing the door gently behind her. Her steps through the manor felt lighter this time, less like escape, more like choice. Outside, the cold air met her like truth. She breathed it in deeply, letting the remnants of Hallstrom Manor fall away with each exhale. She had stood her ground. She had spoken her truth. And for the first time in a long time, it felt enough. The door closed behind Marianne with a softness that struck Cedric more sharply than a slammed exit ever could. He remained where he stood, his hand still loosely gripping the edge of the table, as though the strength he usually carried had slipped from his grasp the moment she walked away. For several long seconds he did not move. Her presence lingered in the quiet of the library, an imprint, a shape in the air, a memory settling too quickly into silence. Cedric exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, and lowered himself into the nearest chair. He had expected tension. He had expected arguments, raised voices, perhaps even anger. Instead, Marianne had responded with calm determination, a self-possession he had never witnessed from her before. It left him unprepared, stripped of the controlled understanding he had relied upon for years. She had looked him in the eye without yielding. She had refused to sign without hesitation. She had walked out without uncertainty. Cedric's fingers curled against the polished wood of the table. Her refusal did not offend him, it unsettled him. Not because she denied him, but because she did so with a steadiness that revealed how little he understood her. He rose abruptly, unable to remain seated. His steps carried him to the tall windows overlooking the manor grounds. The winter sun cast pale light across the fields, but the landscape failed to offer its usual sense of order. Instead, Cedric felt a tightness spreading across his chest, a quiet but relentless constriction. She is not the same woman who left this house. He leaned his palm against the glass, letting the cold seep into his skin. His reflection stared back at him faintly, the lines of his face more severe than usual. For years he had told himself he understood Marianne. She was gentle, reserved, patient, a woman suited to silence, a woman who would adapt to whatever expectations were set before her. But the woman who stood in this room earlier had carried no trace of that quiet compliance. She had become someone stronger away from him. Cedric turned from the window. The silence in the room pressed on him from all sides. He paced slowly, his thoughts branching into places he had long avoided. He remembered evenings when he found her reading by the fire, the glow softening the tension in her face. He remembered walking past her without stopping, too absorbed in estate matters, too certain she would always be there. He remembered the way she used to greet him, hopeful yet restrained, as though waiting for something he never offered. A word, a question, a moment of closeness. He had given her none of it. Cedric sank into the armchair near the hearth, letting the weight of realization settle fully. He tried to recall the last time he had truly looked at Marianne, looked into her, not past her. He could not find the memory. Every image that rose showed her at a distance, standing quietly at dinners, seated near windows, offering soft comments that he barely acknowledged. He closed his eyes. The truth pressed hard, stripping away the armor he had long mistaken for discipline. He had not merely overlooked her, he had erased her presence without even noticing. The memory of their final night together at the manor came sharply into focus, the winter gala, the murmured conversations, the cold glitter of the chandeliers. He had spoken words he believed necessary at the time, convinced he was addressing an issue with calm propriety. A barren marchioness cannot serve this house. He had not looked at her when he said it. He had not considered how it might cut her. He had not imagined she would leave. Yet she had. And the woman who returned today was not someone he could easily disregard. Cedric opened his eyes and stared into the fireplace, though no fire had been lit. "What have I done?" he murmured, the confession barely audible. The question carried no self-pity, only the raw edge of truth he had refused to touch. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Mr. Ardley stepped in, carrying a tray of tea. "Shall I leave this here, Your Grace?" the butler asked gently. Cedric glanced at him, then at the untouched documents scattered on the table. "Yes, thank you." Ardley set the tray down and hesitated. Lady Marianne appeared well. Cedric stiffened. "Yes." "And composed," Ardley added softly. Cedric's jaw tightened. He gave the smallest nod, signaling dismissal. The butler withdrew without another word, closing the door with respectful quiet. Cedric stood again, returning to the table. He reached for the dissolution papers, but the act felt mechanical, hollow, pointless. The words on the page blurred together, lacking the certainty they once held. He set them down. The room felt too large, too silent, too honest. Cedric lowered himself back into the chair, folding his hands tightly together. He had believed ending the marriage was inevitable. He had believed she would accept it without resistance. He had believed she wanted nothing more than to be free of him, but now he wasn't sure. Her eyes, steady and unflinching, echoed inside him more sharply than he wanted to admit. She had not looked at him with hatred. She had not looked at him with longing. She had looked at him as a stranger she once knew well, a stranger she no longer feared. Cedric exhaled slowly. Something inside him shifted, subtle but undeniable. He could not undo what he had done, but for the first time he understood the weight of it, and understanding, he realized, was the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. The carriage ride back to Briar Hill Cottage felt longer than the journey to Hallstrom Manor, though the road was the same. Marianne sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing fields without truly seeing them. The tension she carried did not settle with distance. Instead, it followed her like a quiet shadow, growing heavier the farther she traveled from the manor's looming walls. She had gone there prepared. She had spoken calmly, clearly, without yielding. Yet now, in the privacy of the carriage, fatigue pressed against her ribs with startling insistence. It was not simply exhaustion from the trip, it was the weight of memories stirred by that single confrontation. When the cottage finally came into view, Marianne felt the faintest relief. The small garden, the ivy climbing the stone walls, the warmth that always waited inside this place held no ghosts, no expectations, no judgments. Mrs. Grant opened the door the moment Marianne stepped down. "You're pale," she said. "Come in at once." Marianne allowed herself to be guided inside. The air smelled faintly of herbs and drying linen, familiar scents that eased the tension in her shoulders. She removed her cloak with a slow motion, letting the warmth of the hearth envelop her. "Sit," Mrs. Grant said firmly. Marianne obeyed. She sank into the cushioned chair near the fire, her breath catching slightly as the truth of her fatigue surfaced at last. Mrs. Grant moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing tea without asking questions. It was a kindness Marianne appreciated more deeply than she could express. When the tea was placed in her hands, Marianne held the cup carefully, absorbing the heat before taking the first sip. "Well?" Mrs. Grant said at last. "How did it go?" Marianne stared into the cup, letting the silence stretch a little longer. "He was different," she said finally. "Different in what way?" "Not cold, not dismissive, but not warm either." She struggled to find the right words. It was as though he didn't know how to behave. Mrs. Grant sat opposite her. "Did he argue when you refused to sign?" "No. That is what unsettled me most." Marianne set the cup down, her fingers lingering at the porcelain rim. "He didn't challenge me, didn't demand. He only watched me, and I couldn't read what he was thinking." "That man has hidden behind silence his entire life," Mrs. Grant muttered. "It doesn't surprise me he has forgotten how to speak like a person." Marianne almost smiled, though the exhaustion overshadowed it. "Perhaps, but there was something else." Mrs. Grant waited. "It felt as though he was seeing me differently," Marianne said quietly. "Not with pity, not with indifference, just differently." She drew a slow breath, and I didn't know how to react to that. Mrs. Grant's expression softened. "You've changed. He notices." Marianne looked away. "I don't want his attention." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Grant replied. "But attention and understanding are not always the same." Marianne considered that. She leaned back in her chair, the fire's warmth easing the tightness in her chest little by little. She had gone into that library determined, but now that she was safe within these familiar walls, the emotional toll settled fully. For years, she had walked through Hallstrom Manor carrying hope so fragile she barely dared to touch it. She had tried to reach him through conversation, through gestures of kindness, through patience. And every time she received silence in return, she had lowered her expectations until they were almost invisible. She rested her hand on her abdomen. The child within her was quiet today, as though sensing her fatigue. The gesture brought a small comfort, a reminder that she was not the same woman who had once allowed herself to shrink inside those grand, cold halls. Mrs. Grant's voice was gentle. "Did seeing him reopen old wounds?" "Yes," Marianne whispered, "but not in the way I expected." "How so?" "It wasn't pain alone." Marianne's fingers tightened slightly. "It was recognition." Mrs. Grant frowned. "Recognition? I saw the distance between us clearly," Marianne said. "Before, I only felt it. Today I saw it, how little we knew of each other, how much was lost in silence. It was as though the years we spent together had been folded and put away. And what did that make you feel? Mrs. Grant asked. Marianne let out a slow exhale. Strangely, free. Mrs. Grant's expression eased. That is not strange at all. Marianne pressed her fingertips lightly against her temple. I thought returning to the manor would unravel me. I thought seeing him would make everything worse. But instead I felt something else. She paused. I felt distance. True, undeniable distance. And for once, I didn't fear it. Mrs. Grant watched her with quiet understanding. You found what you needed. Perhaps only the beginning of it, Marianne said. She finished her tea and set the cup aside. The warmth inside her settled into something calmer, still tender, still uncertain, but no longer overwhelming. I don't know what comes next, she said softly. You don't have to know, Mrs. Grant replied. You only have to rest. Marianne nodded, letting her head rest against the back of the chair. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, but inside the cottage remained steady. For the first time since receiving Cedric's letter, Marianne allowed her eyes to close. She had faced him, she had spoken her truth, and she had walked away without regret. What came next would unfold in its own time. Cedric did not leave the library for a long while after Marianne's steps vanished down the corridor. He remained standing in the center of the room, hands loosely at his sides, as though any movement might cause the fragile composure he held to break open completely. Her silence as she exited had been calm, too calm, not indifferent, not hostile, but controlled in a way that unsettled him more deeply than her anger ever could have. It was the composure of someone no longer tethered to him, someone who did not expect anything from him, someone who could walk away without hesitation. That realization struck harder than he anticipated. He finally moved, though each motion felt heavy. He crossed the room, stopped at the window, and rested a hand against the cool glass. Outside, the manor grounds stretched wide and orderly symmetrical hedges, mature oaks lining the central path, stone walls standing as firm as tradition itself. Once, this view had steadied him. Hollow. Cedric drew a slow breath. The library, usually his refuge of control, felt foreign. He turned back to the room, his gaze falling on the dissolution papers still lying in perfect alignment on the table. He approached them, fingertips brushing the top page. He should have felt certainty. This was what he had initiated. This was what he told himself he needed. Yet now, standing alone in the room where she had refused to bend, the certainty he once held dissolved into uneasy fragments. She had said so little, but her presence had said far more. He lowered himself into the chair and leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished wood. A faint ache pressed behind his eyes, a tension built not from anger, but from the growing awareness that he had never understood her. Not then, not now, and certainly not in the years they lived under the same roof. He sifted through memories with a heaviness he could not avoid. He remembered dinners eaten in silence, where he believed her quiet meant contentment. He remembered mornings when she greeted him softly, and he responded with a curt nod, believing efficiency was kindness. He remembered her attempts to speak gently about matters that troubled her, only for him to dismiss them as inconsequential. He remembered the night of the gala, when he delivered a sentence that had shattered something inside her, but he had not seen the shattering then. He had simply acted as though he was stating a necessary truth. He swallowed. I did not know her at all. The admission was quiet, nearly whispered, but saying it aloud made it undeniable. He pressed a hand to his forehead. The weight of recognition settled deeper. He used to believe that silence preserved dignity. That distance ensured order. That emotion muddied judgment. He never realized that his silence had built walls between them, thick enough to isolate her completely. And seeing her today steady, composed, untouched by his authority, showed him how wide the chasm had become. A knock sounded softly. Mr. Ardley stepped inside. Your Grace, the butler said. The staff wonder if you require luncheon. No, Cedric said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. Ardley hesitated, then said carefully, Lady Marianne appeared well. Cedric's jaw tightened. She did, and certain, Ardley added gently. Cedric looked up sharply, but the butler's eyes remained respectful, not intrusive. You may go, Cedric said. When he was alone again, he sank deeper into the chair. Uncertainty churned beneath his ribs, not because she had refused to sign, but because for the first time he sensed that refusal had nothing to do with him. She wasn't refusing out of love. She wasn't refusing out of hope. She was refusing out of self-respect, and that shook him more than he wanted to admit. He stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. He began pacing the room slowly, his steps carrying the weight of years he had left unexplored. His mind returned to the early days of their marriage, the quiet optimism in her eyes, the small gestures she made to reach him, the grace she tried to offer. He remembered brushing aside those moments without understanding their meaning. He thought of her leaving the manor, no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just a soft, final withdrawal. And he understood it differently now. She had not fled. She had simply stopped fighting for something she carried alone. Cedric stopped pacing and braced both hands on the back of a chair. A slow breath escaped him. She had built a life without him. She had found strength without him. And she had returned today without fear. He had never felt more unsure of his place. The dissolution papers lay untouched on the table. Cedric looked at them again, but this time, instead of seeing an administrative step, he saw the final thread severing a bond he had allowed to wither long before either of them admitted it. For the first time, he wondered if he truly wanted that thread to break. The thought unsettled him further. Want was something he did not allow himself. Need was something he rarely acknowledged. Yet standing here, with the silence she left behind, he felt the sharp edge of both. He moved to the window again. The grounds looked unchanged, but he felt profoundly different. The world had not moved, but something inside him had shifted unmistakably. Marianne's composure had revealed more than anger ever could. He was losing her not simply as a wife, but as someone he should have valued far sooner. And for the first time, Cedric felt fear, not of failure, not of scandal, but of the possibility that he had broken something he would never have the chance to repair. Cedric woke the next morning with the same heaviness that had settled in him the night before. Sleep had offered no clarity, only a dim awareness of how unfamiliar his thoughts had become. He dressed quietly, declining breakfast, and stepped out into the cold morning air with a purposeful stride that felt more like restlessness than resolve. Hallstrom Manor stood behind him, grand and silent, but Cedric barely looked back. The questions that chased him through the night had not eased. Instead, they grew sharper. He needed answers, ones he had never bothered to seek. He chose to walk rather than take a carriage. The brisk air kept his mind focused as he followed the path leading toward the village of Northcombe. Frost clung to the grass, and the ground hardened beneath his boots, each step echoing his unease. The small stone building that housed Dr. Llewellyn's practice came into view at last. Cedric paused outside the door, drawing a long, steadying breath before knocking. The doctor opened it moments later, surprise flickering across his expression before he masked it with professionalism. "Your Grace," Dr. Llewellyn said, bowing his head. "How may I assist you?" "I need a word," Cedric replied. "Privately." The doctor gestured him inside. The examination room smelled faintly of herbs and ink, a modest space cluttered with medical volumes and glass vials. Cedric remained standing even when offered a chair. "This concerns Lady Marianne," he said. "Doctor." Llewellyn folded his hands calmly. "Is she in distress?" Cedric hesitated at the question, then shook his head. "No, she appears well." He paused. "Better than I expected." "I'm glad to hear it," the doctor said gently. Then after a moment, "How may I help?" Cedric looked away briefly, gathering the words he had avoided for years. "During our marriage, you examined her on several occasions." "I did. You told me she would have difficulty conceiving." "I said it was possible, Doctor," Llewellyn corrected softly. "Not certain." Cedric stiffened. "You must understand I acted on the information I was given. I believed—" "You believed her body had failed her." The doctor finished when Cedric faltered. Cedric did not speak. The truth in the doctor's tone struck like a quiet blow. Dr. Llewellyn continued, choosing his words with care. "Your Grace, Lady Marianne's examinations showed no inherent physical concern. Her health was sound, her cycles were consistent. Nothing in her constitution suggested she could not carry a child." Cedric stared at him, unable to mask his confusion. "Then why—" "Because," the doctor interrupted gently, "the body is not separate from the mind." Cedric frowned. "Explain." Dr. Llewellyn took a seat, folding his hands atop his knee. "A woman living under prolonged emotional strain may struggle to conceive even if she is physically capable. Stress changes the body's rhythms. Anxiety alters its balance. A lack of security can quiet its natural functions." Cedric stood absolutely still. "You think her difficulty came from strain?" "I do not think, Your Grace. I believe it strongly." The doctor met his gaze. Lady Marianne lived with a great weight on her shoulders. She carried worry quietly. That sort of burden has consequences. Cedric's jaw tightened, but not with anger, with something closer to fear. Why did you not say this more plainly? I did, Dr. Llewellyn replied gently. But you dismissed the idea. You insisted duty came before comfort. You told me she would adapt. Cedric closed his eyes briefly as the memory surfaced a conversation he barely recalled, one he had brushed aside with measured indifference. The doctor continued, Lady Marianne never voiced complaint. That made it difficult for me to insist further. But make no mistake, her inability to conceive at the time was not rooted in her body. It was rooted in her life. My life, Cedric whispered. Dr. Llewellyn did not soften his response. Yes. Cedric felt the words settle over him like a cold, bitter fog. He moved to the small window, bracing a hand on the sill. Outside, the streets of Northcombe were quiet, ordinary, undisturbed. Nothing in the world seemed out of place except the truth he had avoided for so long. So all these years, Cedric murmured, I blamed her for something I created. Quote, You blamed her because it was easier than examining your own role, the doctor said gently. But easier is not always kinder. Cedric's throat tightened. He had believed himself rational, fair, controlled. Yet in this small room, he saw himself clearly for the first time not as the disciplined man he prided himself on being, but as someone so afraid of his own vulnerability that he placed the burden on the woman who had once stood beside him. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. She carried that alone. She did, the doctor replied, and she carried it with dignity. Cedric felt the ache deepen beneath his sternum. Is she safe now? She appears healthier than when I last saw her, Dr. Llewellyn said. Whatever life she has built, she carries it with more ease. Cedric understood the implication immediately. She was better without him. That truth landed with a weight heavier than guilt. It was understanding. A painful, necessary understanding. He turned back to the doctor. Thank you, he said, voice low. You've told me more than I deserve to hear. Dr. Llewellyn stood and bowed his head. If you truly wish to make amends, Your Grace, begin by seeing her clearly, without the shadows of your fears. Cedric nodded once, the motion stiff but sincere. Then he stepped toward the door. As he exited the small building, the cold air struck him, but he did not lift his collar to block it. He welcomed the sting. It felt honest, something sharp enough to cut through years of denial. He began the walk back to the manor with slow, deliberate steps. Everything had changed. Everything now demanded action. He could not undo the pain he caused, but he could choose what he did next. And for the first time, he knew exactly where to begin. The walk back to Hallstrom Manor felt longer than the journey to Northcombe. Cedric kept his gaze fixed ahead, but his thoughts drifted relentlessly around the truth he had just heard. Every step seemed to press more weight onto his shoulders, as though the ground itself demanded acknowledgement of his part in Marianne's suffering. By the time he reached the manor gates, the cold air had numbed his fingers, yet the heaviness in his chest only grew sharper. He made his way through the entrance hall without speaking to anyone. Servants paused respectfully as he passed, but he did not return their glances. His focus lay inward, pulled toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. In the study, the silence pressed in around him with unusual force. He closed the door, crossed the room, and stood behind his desk. The familiar order, the neatly stacked ledgers, the arranged quills, the inkstand aligned, perfectly felt foreign now, as though they belonged to someone he had pretended to be. Slowly, he sat down. He placed both hands on the surface of the desk, fingers spread slightly, grounding himself. He needed to write. He needed to put words where silence had ruled for too long. But when he reached for the quill, his hand hovered, unsure. Apologizing was not something he had ever learned. He had lived much of his life within a framework of duty, precision, and distance. To admit fault personal fault felt like stepping into unknown territory, yet he could not deny what he now understood. Marianne had borne the consequences of his silence, his rigidity, his fear, his refusal to confront vulnerability. Cedric drew a long breath and finally picked up the quill. He dipped it in ink and let the tip rest against the parchment. For a long moment he simply stared at the blank page. Then, slowly, he began to write. Marianne, I am writing not because I expect anything from you, but because there are truths I can no longer leave unspoken. His grip on the quill tightened slightly. The words felt heavy, but necessary. I have lived most of my life believing discipline was strength. That distance protected order. That silence prevented mistakes. I see now that those beliefs blinded me. They allowed me to overlook the one person who deserved my attention most. He paused, remembering the way she stood before him in the library, steady, unflinching, untouched by the authority he once thought absolute. I told myself, I understood you. I did not. I did not listen when I should have. I did not ask what burden you carried. I did not stand beside you when you were alone. I made assumptions that were not mine to make. His chest tightened. He pressed the quill more firmly to the page. Today I learned from Dr. Llewellyn what I refused to hear years ago. You were not the cause of our struggles. You were not the source of the silence between us. The fault was mine, both for what I said and for everything I failed to see. He paused again, letting the ache settle. I blamed you for something I never took the time to understand. I burdened you with expectations while offering nothing that resembled support. I understand now that my silence caused you harm no words can erase. His writing slowed. I do not ask for forgiveness. I have not earned it, and I know it is not easily given. I write because you deserve to hear the truth from me, not the duke you married, not the man who hid behind duty, but the person who finally sees what he destroyed. He exhaled shakily, the weight in his chest making the next lines feel almost impossible. If you allow it, I wish for a conversation, one free of documents and obligations, conducted as equals, nothing more. If you choose not to respond, I will accept that, without question. Whatever path you choose, you will have my respect, something I should have given you long before now. He signed his name with a hand that trembled slightly. Cedric Hallstrom. For a moment, Cedric simply stared at the folded letter, unable to move. The words on the page were raw, far more honest than anything he had ever written. They stripped away the layers he had built around himself for years, leaving him exposed in ways he had never imagined. But they were true, and truth was the only thing he could offer her now. He sealed the letter plain wax, no crest, and rang for Mr. Ardley. The butler entered quietly. Your Grace? Deliver this to Briar Hill Cottage, Cedric said. Directly to her hands, no attendants, no carriage. Ardley accepted the letter with a small bow and left the room. When Cedric was alone again, he leaned back in his chair and let his gaze fall on the empty fireplace. His chest still felt tight, but the tension had shifted into something different, still painful, but honest. For the first time in years he had spoken without hiding. Whatever came next would depend on her, but he had finally taken the first step toward becoming a man worthy of the apology he had given. Marianne noticed the knock before Mrs. Grant did a soft, measured sound at the cottage door. She had been mending a loose seam on one of her dresses, the quiet rhythm of needle and thread slowing her thoughts after the long, draining day before. The knock interrupted that calm with an unfamiliar weight. Mrs. Grant opened the door, exchanged a few hushed words with someone outside, and returned holding a sealed letter. Her expression held a mixture of curiosity and caution. It's from him, Mrs. Grant said. Marianne set her sewing aside, her fingers suddenly still. The parchment in Mrs. Grant's hand bore no crest, no symbol of Hallstrom authority, only her name written plainly in Cedric's unmistakable handwriting. He had written to her, not summoned, not commanded, written. She accepted the letter, its edges cool against her fingertips. She sat back on the sofa, drawing in a breath she couldn't fully steady. The cottage felt quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves recognized the significance of what she held. Mrs. Grant hesitated. Do you want me to stay? Marianne shook her head. No, I should read this alone. Mrs. Grant squeezed her shoulder once before retreating to the kitchen, leaving Marianne with the letter resting lightly on her lap. For a long moment, she did nothing. She simply watched the folded parchment, trying to prepare herself. She did not know what Cedric could possibly say. Part of her feared cold formalities. Another part feared a plea. But the largest part, the bruised, guarded part, feared sincerity. Sincerity could be the cruelest thing if she allowed herself to believe it. At last, she broke the seal. The letter unfolded easily, revealing careful handwriting softened at the edges, as though written without the rigid control he once favored. She began reading. Marianne, I am writing not because I expect anything from you, but because there are truths I can no longer leave unspoken. Her breath caught. She continued. Each sentence carried a weight she was not prepared for. She felt it quietly, an ache that spread slowly, not sharp but deep. Cedric admitted to things she once begged him silently to see. He wrote of fear, of pride, of distance he chose rather than understood. He confessed that he had burdened her without knowing, that he had mistaken silence for strength and discipline for care. He spoke of Dr. Llewellyn. He spoke of mistakes she had carried alone. He spoke of regret without pleading for absolution. Marianne gripped the edge of the letter, her knuckles whitening. She had imagined many versions of Cedric's words over the years, apologies spoken too late, explanations offered too coldly, denials cloaked in formality. But she had never imagined this, a letter stripped of armor. Honest, unprotected, Human. She paused halfway through, needing breath. The cottage remained still around her, as though suspended. She felt a flutter beneath her ribs, the faint movement that always reminded her she was no longer living solely for herself. The child seemed to shift in response to her unease, as if sensing the turmoil rippling through her. She rested a hand lightly on her abdomen and resumed reading. I do not ask for forgiveness. I have not earned it. I write because you deserve to hear the truth. Her throat tightened. He was not asking for anything. He was not demanding she return. He was not promising change as a means to win her. He was simply offering acknowledgement, something he had never given her when they were married. When she reached the final line, she let the letter fall gently onto her lap. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply sat there, feeling the edges of her defenses shift almost imperceptibly. After several minutes, Mrs. Grant appeared in the doorway. She must have sensed the stillness. What did he say? She asked softly. Marianne looked down at the letter before answering. More than I expected. More than I imagined he was capable of saying. Mrs. Grant approached slowly. And what did it make you feel? Marianne considered the question. The answer was not simple. It hurt, she said, because it was true, and because I spent years hoping to hear even a fraction of what he wrote. Mrs. Grant's eyes softened. Does it change anything? I don't know, Marianne whispered. It doesn't undo what happened, but it opens a space where there was none. Mrs. Grant nodded. A crack can let in light. It can also cause collapse. You must be careful. Quote, I know, Marianne murmured. I won't forget the past, and I don't trust easily anymore. She touched the folded letter again. But I cannot ignore sincerity when I see it. Mrs. Grant placed a gentle hand on her arm. You don't need to decide anything today. No, Marianne said, but I should reply. She rose and walked to her writing desk. Her steps were steady, though not driven by emotion. She sat, pulled out a sheet of parchment, and dipped her pen in ink. Her reply was brief, measured, honest. She wrote that she received his letter. She wrote that she appreciated his acknowledgement. She wrote that she was willing to meet, but only in her own space, at Briarhill Cottage, and only as equals, without expectations, without assumptions. She did not promise anything more. When she sealed the letter, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Not hope, not reconciliation, merely clarity. She set the letter aside for the morning courier and returned to the living room. The fire crackled softly, the warmth filling the room, grounding her. The wall she had built around her heart remained intact, but for the first time she felt one faint line of tension running through it, a line that had not been there before Cedric's letter arrived. Cedric received Marianne's reply the next morning. The courier handed him the letter with a respectful nod, but Cedric barely acknowledged him. He retreated into his study, closing the door behind him before unfolding the parchment with careful, uncertain hands. Her handwriting was neat, familiar, and steady. She thanked him for his honesty. She acknowledged his letter without bitterness. She agreed to meet, but only at Briarhill Cottage, only as equals, only without expectations. Cedric read her words twice, then a third time, each reading sinking deeper into him. She had not forgiven him, nor had she pushed him away. Her reply was measured, controlled, but undeniably sincere. She was willing to listen, and that was more than he deserved. He folded the letter, placed it gently inside his coat, and left the study with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with duty. The walk to the manor gates felt shorter this time. When he reached the main road, he instructed the driver to take him only halfway to Eastbury. I'll walk from there, he said. The driver hesitated but obeyed. Cedric stepped down when the carriage halted along the quiet lane. The remaining path toward Briarhill Cottage curved between narrow hedgerows, a peaceful contrast to the rigid grandeur of the manor he had left behind. Cedric walked slowly, deliberately. He rehearsed nothing. Earlier attempts at forming his thoughts had felt hollow, and Marianne had explicitly asked him not to arrive with words polished into shape. She wanted truth, unguarded and unarranged. When Briarhill Cottage finally appeared, Cedric paused at the small gate. He stood there for a breath, taking in the ivy climbing the stone walls, the thin curl of smoke drifting from the chimney, the sense of warmth surrounding the small structure. This was her sanctuary. He lifted the latch and stepped inside. Before he could knock, the door opened. Marianne stood there, her expression calm, her posture poised but not rigid. Her dress was simple, her hair loosely pinned, and there was something quietly radiant about her presence that startled him. "Cedric," she said. He inclined his head. "Marianne." She stepped back slightly. "Come in." The living room was warm, lit by the soft glow of the hearth. Cedric removed his gloves and coat, feeling strangely unsure of where to stand until she gestured toward the chair near the fire. He sat. She took the seat opposite him, folding her hands lightly in her lap. For a moment, neither spoke. Marianne broke the silence first. "I read your letter carefully." Cedric nodded. "Thank you. It was unexpected," she continued. "Not because you wrote to me, but because of what you wrote." Cedric swallowed. "I meant every word." She studied his face not harshly, but with a kind of quiet scrutiny that made him feel more exposed than any confrontation ever had. "I believe you did," she said. He exhaled slowly, relief and tension twisting together. "I want to understand you. Truly understand, not as I assumed you were." Marianne looked down briefly, tracing an invisible line on her skirt. "Understanding is not a small thing, Cedric." "I know," he replied. "Then why now?" she asked softly. "After years of distance, why reach for truth only when everything has fallen apart?" Cedric took a moment before answering. "Because I spent years convincing myself that silence protected me. I thought keeping my fears hidden made me strong, but all it did was make me blind. And losing you, truly losing you, made me see what I had refused to face." Marianne's expression remained unreadable, but something in her eyes softened. Cedric continued, voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can mend what I broke. I don't know if you would even want that, but I want to learn who you are without the walls I put between us." Her fingers tightened slightly. "You speak of change, but change is slow." "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm not asking for more than a chance." Another silence settled lighter than before, but still fragile. Marianne rose then, walked to the window, and looked out toward the small garden. Cedric remained in his chair, waiting. He did not follow, did not interrupt, did not try to fill the space between them. After a long moment, she turned back to him. "I don't want to rebuild what we had. That life hurt both of us, even if only one of us noticed." Cedric lowered his gaze. "I understand," I quote. "But," she said, stepping closer, "I don't know what a new beginning would look like, and I'm afraid of expecting too much." Cedric met her eyes. "Then expect nothing from me. Let me earn whatever place you choose to give." She studied him again, as though searching for the man she once longed to understand. And for the first time, she saw something unguarded in him, something that had never been there before. She drew in a slow breath. "If we try, it must be slowly." "Great." A soft, stunned silence followed her words. Cedric's chest tightened not with triumph, but with a humbled gratitude he made no attempt to hide. "Slowly," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "I can do that." Marianne did not step closer, nor did she pull away. She simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of a possibility neither of them had expected to reach. It was not reconciliation, not yet. It was the smallest beginning, fragile, tentative, real. Cedric rose from his seat, understanding instinctively that the meeting had reached its natural close. "May I come again?" he asked. Marianne considered the question with measured thought. "You may." Cedric bowed his head slightly, not as a duke, but as a man grateful for a chance he had once destroyed. Then he stepped toward the door. Before opening it, he paused and looked back at her. "Thank you," he said softly. Marianne did not smile, but her expression held a calm acceptance that felt like the first ray of light after a long winter. He left the cottage with quiet steps, the cold air meeting him the moment he closed the door behind him. For the first time in years, Cedric felt something unfamiliar beneath the winter wind, hope gentle and uncertain, but undeniably present. The days that followed their conversation passed quietly, but not without movement. Cedric returned to Briarhill Cottage the next afternoon, just as Marianne had permitted. He arrived without fanfare, always on foot, and always with the same steady, almost tentative expression, an expression that revealed more humility than he had shown in all the years of their marriage. At first, their conversations were brief. He asked simple questions, unsure how far to reach. She answered with the same measured honesty she had given him in her letter. They spoke of practical matters before touching anything deeper, but with each visit, something shifted barely noticeable, yet undeniably present. Cedric began arriving earlier, offering to help with small tasks. Marianne accepted his assistance only when she wished to. He did not press whenever she declined, and she found that restraint unexpectedly comforting. One afternoon, he helped Mrs. Grant carry firewood. Another day, he swept leaves from the small path to the door. He did these things not out of obligation, but because he seemed to want to understand how she lived. The change was gradual, nearly delicate. like the quiet softening of winter into early spring. Marianne observed him carefully. His posture remained formal, but his manner had grown gentler. He listened instead of correcting. He paused before speaking, as though weighing the effect of his words. Most surprising of all, he looked at her, truly looked without judgment or assumption. There were still moments of tension. At times, a memory surfaced too quickly, cutting between them with old hurt. When that happened, Cedric did not retreat. He asked what she needed. He did not assume he knew. Marianne found that difficult to ignore. As her pregnancy progressed, the changes in her became more visible. She carried the child with quiet dignity, though exhaustion showed more easily in her posture. Cedric noticed every shift. He never addressed it directly unless she did, but he adjusted his visits to ensure she was never overexerted. He brought fresh fruit from the manor gardens, herbs recommended by the midwife, and once, a blanket from the Hallstrom linen store, soft, warm, and chosen with thought. Marianne accepted these gestures with caution, but she accepted them. One evening, she felt a wave of fatigue heavier than usual. Cedric noticed the moment it struck. She saw the concern cross his face before he managed to compose himself. He stepped closer, but not too close. "Should I call for the midwife?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, it is only the day catching up to me." His expression didn't ease, but he respected her response. He stayed until she regained her strength, speaking little, simply offering presence. She realized then that his presence no longer felt like a shadow. It felt grounding. As months passed, the rhythm of their days fell into a pattern she never expected, but slowly learned to appreciate. Cedric would arrive in the afternoon. They would speak near the hearth or walk the small garden path. He never crossed the boundaries she set, and she in turn allowed herself to see the sincerity in his efforts. But the true change revealed itself the night she went into labor. It began with a sharp ache that brought her to her knees. "Mrs." Grant hurried to her side, murmuring calm words while sending a neighbor to fetch the midwife. Cedric, who had arrived only minutes earlier, stepped back at first as though unsure if he belonged in a moment so intimate. Marianne looked up, breath unsteady. "Stay," she whispered. Cedric stilled. The single word carried more trust than anything she had offered him before. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering uncertainly until she placed hers in his. His fingers closed around hers with a careful, protective tension, as though afraid he might harm her by holding too tightly. Hours passed. Cedric did not leave her side. He held her hand through the worst of the pain. He offered water when she could drink, silence when she could not speak. His presence did not command, it supported. When she cried out, he steadied her without telling her to be strong. When fear flickered across her face, he murmured reassurance, not grand promises, just the quiet truth that he was there. When the child finally arrived, small, red-faced, letting out a cry that filled the room, Marianne felt a soft collapse inside her, a release of everything she had carried alone. Mrs. Grant placed the newborn in her arms, and Cedric leaned close but did not reach. He waited for her signal. She nodded gently. He touched the child's tiny hand with trembling fingers. The brief contact unraveled him. She saw the emotion tighten his throat, saw the wonder in his eyes, saw something open within him that she had never glimpsed before. For a moment, they said nothing. But the silence was warm, alive, nothing like the silence that had once haunted their marriage. Marianne looked down at the child, then at Cedric. "We have a new beginning," she said quietly. "But I won't return to the life we had before." Cedric nodded. "I know, and I will not ask you to." Gumsleft. She rested her head back against the pillows, exhausted but steady. "If we return to Hallstrom Manor, it will be on my terms. No silence, no distance, no walls." Cedric held her gaze. "On your terms," he said, "and mine, if you allow me to learn how to build something different." She considered him for a long moment. His face was open, unguarded, stripped of the rigid distance he once carried like armor. "Yes," she said softly, "we will learn. Go." And they did return weeks later, not as the couple they had once been, but as a family reshaping itself one quiet, honest step at a time. Hallstrom Manor felt different when she crossed its threshold again, not because the house had changed, but because she had, and because Cedric walked beside her with a new understanding of what partnership meant. Their future was not perfect. It did not need to be. It was theirs. And for the first time, it felt true.